The air was thick with the golden glow of the late afternoon sun as Eleanor St. Clair strolled through the park near her estate. The wealthy widow, known for her elegance and grace, had spent the day attending charity meetings and business affairs, as she often did. But today, something felt different. The breeze carried an unusual stillness, and despite the warmth of the setting sun, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She took a deep breath, letting the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass calm her. But then, something shattered the peaceful moment. A sharp cry, desperate and urgent, rang through the air. Eleanor's head snapped toward the direction of the sound. It was coming from the small pond, just beyond the stone pathway. Her heart pounded as she hurried toward it, her designer heels clicking against the pavement. As she reached the pond, her breath caught in her throat. A boy, no older than 10, was thrashing in the water, his tiny arms flailing, his mouth barely above the surface, his panicked eyes locked onto hers, silently pleading for help. Eleanor hesitated for only a second before kicking off her shoes and wading into the water, not caring about the expensive silk of her dress. The water was icy, sending a jolt through her body as she struggled toward the boy. He was sinking fast, his small frame weakening. With a final lunge, Eleanor grabbed his arm and pulled him up, wrapping her arms tightly around him. He coughed and gasped, his frail body trembling. Slowly, she guided him toward the shore, her heart racing as she held him close. Once they reached solid ground, she gently laid him down, brushing the wet hair from his forehead. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his tiny frame. He looked pale, exhausted, but he was breathing. Relief flooded through her. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. The boy didn't answer right away. His lips quivered, and his chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. Eleanor removed her shawl and wrapped it around his shivering body. He clutched it tightly, still gasping for air. "Where are your parents?" she asked, scanning the park. There was no sign of anyone looking for a missing child. Still, the boy remained silent. His large dark eyes were filled with something Eleanor couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or sadness. Then, as she helped him sit up, her gaze fell upon something glinting against his chest. A pendant hanging from a thin, worn-out chain. Eleanor's breath hitched. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, her heart pounding harder than when she had pulled him from the water. It was impossible, unbelievable even, and yet, there it was, cold against her fingertips, a symbol she recognized all too well, a symbol that should not be on this child. For a moment, the world around her blurred. Her heartbeat thundered in, her ears. Memories, ones she had buried deep within herself, began to resurface. No, it couldn't be. Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing herself to look at the boy again. Where did you get this?" she whispered, barely able to find her voice. The boy, now clutching the pendant protectively, looked up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. And then, for the first time, he spoke. "My mother gave it to me," he said, softly. Eleanor's fingers curled into her palm. A chill ran down her spine, because she knew that pendant, and she knew the woman who had once worn it. A woman who should have been long gone. Her pulse raced as she stared at the child, realization dawning upon her like a dark storm rolling in. Who was this boy? And why did he have something that should have been buried in the past? Eleanor's hands felt cold as she stared at the boy, her mind racing. The pendant glinted under the soft glow of the evening sun, taunting her with memories she had spent, years trying to forget. The past had a cruel way of catching up, and right now, it was staring back at her through the wide, innocent eyes of a child. She forced herself to breathe, to steady the storm rising inside her. "Your mother," she whispered. "What's her name?" The boy hesitated. He clutched the pendant tighter, as if afraid she might take it from him. "Mama told me not to talk to strangers," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's chest tightened. "I understand," she said gently, brushing his damp hair from his forehead. "But I just saved your life, sweetheart. I just want to help." The boy studied her carefully. There was something about the way he looked at her, like he was trying to decide if she could be trusted. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "Her name is Isabel." Eleanor felt like the ground beneath her had vanished. The name hit her like a crashing wave, stealing the breath from her lungs. Isabel, a name she hadn't spoken in over a decade. A name that should have been lost to time. She swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. "Isabel," she repeated. "Where is she?" The boy's expression darkened. He dropped his gaze, his small fingers toying with the pendant. "She's sick," he said quietly. "She told me to wait for her. She said she'd come back, but she didn't." Eleanor's stomach twisted. Something was very wrong. "Where do you live?" she asked. The boy pointed toward a row of old apartment buildings, near the edge of the city. Eleanor recognized them instantly. They were in one of the roughest parts of town. It made no sense. Isabel wasn't supposed to be here. She had vanished years ago, without a trace. Eleanor had searched for her, had hired private investigators, had spent sleepless nights wondering if Isabel was even still alive. But no matter how far she reached, Isabel had remained a ghost. And yet, here was this boy, wearing her pendant, speaking her name. Eleanor's mind was spinning. If Isabel was alive, why hadn't she come back? Why hadn't she reached out? And why was her son alone, nearly drowning in a pond with no one to look after him? She placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Daniel," he said. "Okay, Daniel." She exhaled slowly. "I'm going to take you home, all right? We'll find your mother." Daniel's eyes flickered with something. Hope, maybe, or uncertainty. He nodded slowly. Eleanor helped him to his feet, her mind already racing through the possibilities. She didn't know what she would find when they got there. But one thing was clear. This wasn't a coincidence. Something had brought Isabel's son into her path today, and whatever it wasn't finished yet. The drive to the apartment complex was quiet. Daniel sat in the passenger seat of Eleanor's luxury car, staring out the window as the city lights flickered past. His small fingers were still curled around the pendant, as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Eleanor stole glances at him, her heart tightening with every passing second. He looked so much like Isabel. Same dark eyes, same delicate features. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. As they reached the building, Eleanor's stomach churned. The place was run down, with cracked walls and broken streetlights casting eerie shadows. She couldn't believe Isabel had been living here. Daniel led her up the narrow staircase, his small footsteps echoing through the empty halls. They stopped in front of a door with peeling paint. "This is it," he said. Eleanor knocked, her pulse pounding. No answer. She tried again, harder this time. Still nothing. Daniel fidgeted beside her. "Maybe she's sleeping," he whispered. Eleanor reached for the doorknob. To her surprise, it turned easily. The door was unlocked. A cold feeling crept up her spine as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy with silence. The apartment was small, barely furnished. A single chair sat in the corner, a few dishes. In the sink, the curtains were drawn, casting the room in dim shadows. And then Eleanor saw her, Isabel, lying on the small couch, motionless. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't breathe. "Isabel!" Her voice broke as she rushed forward. Daniel ran ahead, shaking his mother's shoulder. "Mama, wake up!" Eleanor pressed her fingers to Isabel's wrist. A faint pulse. She was breathing. Barely. Relief crashed over her, but it was quickly replaced by fear. Isabel's face was pale, her body weak. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. "Call an ambulance," Eleanor said urgently. Daniel fumbled with the phone. On the table, his hands shaking, Eleanor brushed the hair from Isabel's face, her eyes stinging with tears. "What happened to you?" she whispered. Isabel's lips parted, a weak breath escaping, but before she could say anything, her eyes fluttered shut. Eleanor felt her heart drop as Isabel's eyes fluttered shut. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, but there was no time to panic. She gently shook her, hoping for any sign of movement, but Isabel remained still. The wail of approaching sirens broke through the heavy silence. Daniel clung to Eleanor's arm, his small fingers digging into her sleeve. His eyes, wide with fear, never left his mother's face. "She's going to be okay," Eleanor whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. Moments later, paramedics rushed in, swiftly assessing Isabel's condition. Eleanor stepped back, holding Daniel close, as they carefully lifted Isabel onto a stretcher. One of the paramedics turned to Eleanor. "She's severely malnourished and dehydrated. We need to get her to the hospital immediately." Eleanor nodded, already following them out the door. She wasn't going to leave Isabel, not now. Daniel tightened his grip on her hand. "I want to go with her," he said, his voice small. Eleanor knelt in front of him. "We will," she promised. "I'll be right there with you." They rode to the hospital in tense silence, the beeping of machines and the murmured voices of the medical staff filling the air. Eleanor's mind raced, trying to piece together the missing parts of the story. How had Isabel ended up here, alone, and struggling? Why hadn't she reached out? Hours passed in a blur of waiting rooms and hushed conversations. Finally, a doctor approached. "She's stable," he said, "but she's been through a lot. She needs rest, proper nutrition, and time to recover." Relief flooded through Eleanor. "Can I see her?" The doctor nodded. "Only for a few minutes." Eleanor and Daniel stepped inside the hospital room. Isabel looked fragile, but her breathing was steady. When her eyes slowly opened, they filled with tears at the sight of her son. "Daniel," she whispered. Her voice weak, he rushed to her, sighed, wrapping his small arms around her. "Mama, I was so scared." Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. Seeing them together, she felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: relief, sadness, guilt. Isabel's eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was so much unspoken history between them, so many questions that needed answers. Kiane finally broke the silence. "Why didn't you come to me, Isabel?" Her voice was soft, but there was a weight to it. Tears slid down Isabel's face. "I didn't think I could," she admitted. "I was ashamed. I made mistakes, and by the time I wanted to reach out, it felt too late." Eleanor shook her head. "It was never too late." Isabel exhaled shakily. "I tried to start over, but life, it wasn't kind. I got sick. I couldn't work. I didn't want Daniel to see me like this. I told him I'd be back, but I never made it." She looked at Eleanor with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "You saved him. You saved me." Eleanor felt tears sting her own eyes. "You were like a sister to me, Isabel. No matter what happened, you should have known I would have been there for you." Isabel nodded, emotion choking her voice. "I know that now." A long silence stretched between them. But this time, it wasn't heavy with pain. It was filled with something else: understanding, healing, Daniel held onto his mother's hand, his tired eyes blinking up at Eleanor. "Are we going to be okay now?" he asked. Eleanor bent down, smoothing his hair back. "Yes, sweetheart," she said firmly. "You're not alone anymore." And she meant it. As she looked at Isabel, at Daniel, she knew that this moment wasn't just about rescuing them. It was about redemption, about second chances. The past had brought them back together, but the future was theirs to rewrite, and this time, Eleanor wouldn't let them go.